That is a nice dress. Here we go. We are on. Okay, everybody, welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee. Today, not surprisingly, we're going to be talking about presidential immunity. But before we plunge into that, I turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History. Delighted as always. I believe this is marking our 4th year as a community. Someone said Tuesday was literally the 4th anniversary. So happy anniversary. We're excited to be here. We always love gathering with all of you, whether you're new or you've been with us for a long time. If you're new, the way this works is Joanne will talk about today's topic, presidential immunity, for about 30 minutes. And while she's doing that, feel free to engage in the chat. Sometimes there's a bingo card, so you can look for that in the chat if there's a link. In about 30 minutes, I'll come back and I will look in the Q&A for your wonderful questions that have something to do with today's topic. So if you have questions specifically for Joanne, she will listen to those in about 30 minutes, but you got to put them in the Q&A, and I'll see y'all then.
Okay. And if any one of you is here for the first time, you should definitely say so in chat because you will get a robust welcome from the History Matters community, which is a real community after 4 years. 4 years. Okay. Let me begin. And actually, I want to begin talking about presidential immunity with the most basic of basics, because the people who actually wrote the brief deserve credit for actually writing the brief. So, in particular, historians Holly Brewer and Rosie Zagari played key roles in constructing that brief. So, if you go to look at the brief online, and it's happily available there, and I assume, I don't know if Tim is here, but if he is, I'm sure he will provide a link from the Brennan Center to that brief. And you'll see in the back, there's a list of, I see a little thumb come up the side of my screen. You'll see at the back is a list of the people who contributed to the brief, and it's the top names on the first page are the people who were, most involved in the actual writing of the brief. I think Holly said she'd been working on it since December. So I signed on to the brief, but I don't want to suggest that I helped write it because the people who actually did that work for several months deserve all that credit. But I was asked to sign on. I did read it, and I didn't have to think very long to be willing to sign on because it's really, really well done. And I should say here before I forget to say it, since so many of the people watching here are teachers, I've already had, I don't know how many people contact me and say they're going to use it in classrooms. And part of that, it's not because it's just an important subject, it's written really clearly, really accessibly. It's if you give it a read, you're not going to have any problem figuring out what it's arguing. And again, it's a whole bunch of historians who've weighed in, so it's using history in a really powerful way with guidance from legal minds. So I'm proud to sign on anyway. But this particular brief, I think, is classroom friendly, which is not something I would have imagined I would say about very many Supreme Court amicus briefs. But anyway, so I encourage you to look at it, and if it might very well be useful for classroom use, because what it does is it marches through first, historically, the reasons why presidential immunity makes no sense. And it grounds that in the Constitutional Convention, in what happened to state constitutions and state governors after the revolution, and in any number of things with reams of evidence, but not like, weenie, as in page 5 of whatever, it has wonderful, powerful, strong statements of truth about history. This is not the question of whether a president has immunity. This is not a matter of like footnotes. This is pretty clear, and the brief makes that really obvious. So anyway, I recommend that you read it. And then it does at the end include the argument from the other side and what it is that they're using to claim that there's some presidential immunity, which largely is based on what the Constitution doesn't say. And if you're going to claim originalist intent, right? The founders, the framers of the Constitution, here is what they meant about the president. Takes a certain amount of chutzpah to ground that in, and they said nothing about what I'm saying here, but the silence suggests it. I know sometimes that might work as an argument. In this case, when you know any history, really, really doesn't. So some of the basics. On April 25th, so not very far from now, the Supreme Court will consider former President Trump's claims of immunity from conspiracy and obstruction charges related to the 2020 presidential election. So obviously a high profile case. In some way, while I was proud to sign on to it, it's also a little alarming that we have to argue this. So that's an indication to me of precisely where we are politically, that we have to say, no, actually, presidents aren't supposed to have the kind of immunity being presented here. That's not like a subtle constitutional argument. But at any rate, April 25th is going to be the day. And the immunity case, and actually, while I'm thinking of it, a few places I will suggest, Tim, I know you're there, that will be useful just in general for you to look at as you're thinking about this. One is that the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia has a brief explanation of what's going on. And I think best of all is that the Brennan Center, who are the people who are responsible for the brief, they posted up, and I don't have the precise name of it, but they posted an interview with Holly Brewer and Rosie Zagari, the two top authors of the brief. They're interviewed about what it means and what they were thinking. Again, really clear, really straightforward. I know you guys will be able to find it and post it in chat, but that's a really useful review too of the logic here. But the question, one of the fundamental questions here, has to do whether the former president has immunity from criminal prosecution for conduct that supposedly he did as among his official acts during his tenure in office. Now, there's so many aspects of that statement that are problematic, but let's stick for the moment about presidential immunity from criminal prosecution for conduct that in one way or another allegedly had something to do with official acts during his tenure in office. That's really debatable. So the problem here, and I'm going to quote Jack Smith here, he says the idea that presidents do have immunity from criminal prosecution for conduct alleged to involve official acts during their tenure in office, that position finds, is a quote, finds no support in constitutional text, separation of powers principles, history, or logic. Bam. Okay, so that's very true. So here, the Trump team, Trump is charged with conspiring to thwart the peaceful transfer of power following the 2020 election. His team is claiming that a doctrine of permanent immunity from criminal liability for a president's official acts, while not really expressly in the Constitution, should be inferred. And I'm pulling this actually from the brief itself. Very clearly written, as I said. And this is a quote from the brief. To justify this radical assertion, he, the president, contends that the original meaning of the Constitution demands it, but no plausible historical case supports his claim. And that's an understatement. I'll go on with another sentence or two from the brief because it's so wonderfully clear. Sometimes history speaks ambiguously, but here it speaks with surpassing clarity. The principle that a president may be prosecuted, which informed President Nixon's 1974 pardon and President Clinton's 2001 plea bargain, began in the beginning. As James Iredell, one of this court's inaugural justices, explained, if the president commits any crime, he is punishable by the laws of his country. Now, there are a couple things here that are being used as subtleties in this argument. Before I get to that, I just want to touch briefly on, as we do here on History Matters, the historical grounding for what we know of what the framers, if you're going to go back to the framers and say the Constitution suggests immunity, let's go back to the framers and see precisely what they thought and what they said and what they did. Really fundamental, and again, not subtle, is that that generation of Americans fundamentally, supremely distrusted executive power, right? The American Revolution had many layers to it, but a king who surpassed his power in so many ways that it makes up the bulk of the Declaration of Independence, right? A king who seemed like a tyrant, right? That's a problem. And Americans were supremely sensitive to issues of executive power. That was front and center in their thinking, even before they began thinking of the presidency. And you can see that. I just lectured about this on Tuesday or Thursday, this last week, in my American Revolution course. One of the things that many states did when they declared independence, and then the states had to create their own state governments, constitutions, they had to devise state constitutions to take the place of royal authorities. Many states immediately stripped the governor of the state of some of his powers. One of the first things, right? Oh, okay, executive power. We don't trust that. Let's fix that now in these state constitutions that we're drawing up. So even if you're looking for chronological proof, as soon as that generation had the ability to write constitutions, state constitutions, they were like, okay, front and center, strip some executive power away because it's threatening. We're in the middle of watching what happens when they wouldn't have called it an executive, a king who, historically speaking, philosophically speaking, can commit no crime, goes beyond where he should go. That's front and center. That's what Americans were thinking about when they were devising new constitutions on a state level and when they were devising a constitution on the national level. Now, I've talked about this in a variety of different ways before. It's one of the things that I love about studying and speaking about the founding period is that they were trying to do something new. They were trying to create a different kind of government, not a monarchy. In a world of monarchies, the framers and that founding generation, they were trying to create a democratic republic, right? A constitutional republic. A republic that would not have a king. That was supreme. That was first and foremost. That was one of the important things about it, that in a republic, the people rule, right? It's the people. Legislatures are supremely important in republics because they represent the people, and executive power needs to be restrained. So in creating the Constitution, the framers were trying to create a different kind of executive who was really obviously not a king, did not have the privileges of a king or the immunity of a king. So that was one of the major components of it. And I encourage you to go read the debate during the Federal Convention, and it's out there. I think the Library of Congress has it available on their website that I don't know the URL, but it's A Century of Lawmaking. And I think on that master page on the left side and the top, I've seen that page too many times, you can directly connect to notes from the Federal Convention and see how people were debating the national executive and what it should be. Not surprisingly, one of the things that they were worried about, accountability. I know that contingency is my number one word. I would say maybe my number two word as far as frequency and importance when I speak on Friday mornings is accountability. There was a big concern that whoever was going to serve in this new executive position, whatever it was going to be, this non-king executive, that person needed to be accountable, for their power. They, at one point during the Federal Convention, there was a discussion that maybe, they were so afraid of giving that much power to one person, maybe there should be like an executive council instead of a single executive, because then there wouldn't be one person that would have that much power. That idea was defeated for several reasons, but one of them was if you have, let's say, a council of 3 men serving as an executive board, if someone does something wrong, or if they all do something wrong, they can hide behind each other. It will be harder to hold someone accountable. If you have a single executive, one person, if that person does something wrong, it will be easier to hold that person accountable. So accountability is fundamental to our democratic republic. It's fundamental to the grounding idea of our government, that we give power to people. We, the people, give power to politicians. We hold them accountable for how they use that power, and we can take them out of office if we don't like the way they use that power. We can vote them out, or in some cases, we can impeach them. Accountability, right? So immunity is not really friendly to accountability. So that's a problem as well. When you then look at, so we got the Constitutional Convention, you can go again. I'm not offering amazing new interpretations of anything. I'm offering you the absolute basics here, and I'm footnoting my comments with places you can go and read for yourself. You can go find the notes, Farron's notes of the Constitutional Convention. You can read what they said. You can then go and look at the ratifying debates, look at the Federalist essays, the debates. Wisconsin, I believe the University of Wisconsin is responsible for putting the debates, ratification debates, online. You might need to belong to a library that subscribes to the sort of mass project that ratification debates belong to. Someone out here can find that out. But basically, already online, I just don't know whether it's open and free or not, you can read state by state the debates over whether states would or would not ratify the Constitution and what they had to say about the Constitution and about this new chief executive. And you can see how the people who supported the Constitution and wanted it ratified focused a lot of their effort on saying again and again that this new executive, this ultimately president, would not be an elected king. That is not what was happening with the Federal Convention. That is not what the new Constitution was putting into place. And I can say, particularly as a Hamilton person, right? Hamilton really, really, really wanted a strong executive. He said bluntly that he was going to try and push the new government, America's new government, as close as he could get it to the British example. He thought that the British form of government was, this is a paraphrase, but pretty close to what he said, the finest government on the face of the earth. But even he was not arguing for a president that had total immunity, could just stay in office, right? He wanted an executive in office during good behavior who could be removed if there was not good behavior happening on the executive level. Even Hamilton, who's kind of, if there's a spectrum of what people thought about presidential power, Hamilton's, close to one end enough that people called him a monarchist throughout his political career. And he said again and again and again, no, I'm not a monarchist. This guy, he's getting elected and he could be removed. That's not a monarch. It's not a monarch. So even the most, I don't want to call him monarchical because I'll get struck by lightning. Even the most monarch-friendly founders were not claiming sort of monarchical immunity and power that put them above the law. That is not what they were arguing. Now, part of this argument, part of this debate has to do with the complications of impeachment and criminal law. And there's I think at one point, the brief refers to the Trump team's interpretation of the Constitution as a tortured reading that they have of the Constitution. So the Constitution says basically that, a president can be impeached, right? And it explains, we've certainly thought about impeachment a lot in recent years. That's in the Constitution. It also then says that above and beyond impeachment, a president is responsible to the law of the land, can be held criminally responsible, that it's not double jeopardy, that impeachment is a political solution to a problem, and that the law, bringing the law into play is a legal solution to a problem, criminal law. So those aren't the same thing, number one. And number two, even if you're not impeached, you are still responsible to the laws of the land. That's one of the arguments circulating in the Trump team, is that the Constitution suggests that if you're not impeached, that somehow or other criminal law, you cannot be brought to court for a crime, criminal crime. That's not what the Constitution says, but again, tortured reading. And again, if you go to most revolutionary writings of revolutionaries, and even, particularly famous ones like Thomas Paine in Common Sense, right? That the thing that makes the United States different from what's come before is that in America, quote, the law is king. Like, some part of me is talking to you and getting increasingly not quite outraged, but close, because as a historian, this seems so straightforward. It's like in the air of the time that executive power is not to be trusted. It's to be reined in. It's to be limited. It can't be like what came before. And certainly, a president is not above the law. Right? Part of what the Constitution is talking about is how the public can put people in office and then can take people out of office. They go back into being regular citizens. They are responsible for what they did among their fellow citizens. Rotation in office, same idea. Yeah, you may have high office for a while, but then you're going to lose high office and you're going to go back to being a regular citizen. This is not tangled, obscure constitutional reckoning. This is a fundamental way in which the founding generation thought, a fundamental distrust of people at the time, something that they addressed constantly. State constitutions, national constitution, debates over ratification, concerns about George Washington when he became president. When I had a brief exchange in the course of signing on to the immunity brief, one of the things I said was, I'm sure everyone, the writers already knew this, but it's the first thing that comes into my mind when I think about presidential power. George Washington, his copy of the Constitution is at Mount Vernon. I think I've talked about it before. I've certainly posted it somewhere on social media. I'm sure you can find it. But he went through the Constitution, and wherever there was something that had to do with the presidency, he wrote in the margin, president. He was very carefully trying to figure out what his job entailed specifically. And if there's one thing you can say about George Washington, it's that he was supremely aware of the degree to which people were afraid he was going to be a king, and the many, many ways in which he deliberately tried to show people that he wasn't one, that he was something different, that he did not have monarchical power, but he was put in office by the people, would go back to his farm at the end of his presidency, right? That he was not anything like a king. And he said it in one way or another again and again and again, in action, in manner, in dress, in behavior. I think I've talked before about a seemingly trivial example, but it was something that would be visible to people, is that on an almost daily basis, he would take a walk around the block in Philadelphia for the most part, in the capital, to show people that he wasn't a king, because he was walking in the street. He wasn't in a carriage. He was walking in the street like everybody else, which seems on the one hand extreme and trivial, but he got fan mail, right? People understood, Virginians who, they're fans of carriages and horses. But he got people who basically said, letters from people who basically said, excellent, like, we get the point. You're not above the people. You're walking amongst them in the street. So basically, on level after level after level, in multiple ways, over the course of decades, in one way or another, the founding generation and the framers talked about executive overreach, talked about monarchical power, talked about the desperate need to rein in presidential power. I haven't even mentioned, but they also, I've talked before about how historically grounded they were, and that they used all of history, human history, as a guide to suggest what was going to happen. They knew what happened to republics in the past. They knew about Julius Caesar. They knew about people who would grab at a kind of power that they weren't supposed to have and would overturn republics. They knew that, right? That's also in their internal database of things they're scared of that are immediate. Yet another level in which they felt that history proved precisely what happens when you have a national executive of some kind who is enabled to take more power than he should have. Now, in the brief, again, I really encourage you to read it. The brief suggests, and this is from the brief, this is a quote, petitioner, meaning the Trump team, has throughout this matter erroneously argued that criminal immunity for the executive is, quote, deeply rooted in the common law that the framers drew upon when they drafted the Constitution. Now, the brief then goes on in detail to talk about how American common law ultimately was not the same thing as British common law. And they use, that there were changes made in that understanding, and there had to be, given that what was coming into play in the United States was a different form of government. And the brief cites, so Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England is like this primary source of legal knowledge, right? Lawyers studied it when they were studying for the law. It was a primary reference source when it came to the common law and the law in England, and for a good amount of time, obviously, then in the colonies. Apparently, in 1803, the first Americanized edition of Blackstone came out, and it explicitly says, we don't buy into this monarchical stuff. Right? It's interesting. There it is. We're not doing the same thing. That is something I did not know until I read the brief. That just made me happy to read, right? It's like there are people in the past who are saying, I talked about this in my Revolution lecture course as well, that, historians are always really happy when people in the past say, let me offer you a quote that says exactly what you need me to say in really plain terms. And some of that goes on here, right? Again and again and again regarding something as obvious as the question of presidential immunity. At any rate, I see I'm running a couple minutes over. Maybe I'll cut myself off there, mainly to say, as a historian, for many years now, we've been talking about the many ways in which history can inform the present. History can inform our current politics. At this moment in time, and I think I copied a quote, I did. Rosie Zagari, in the interview that the Brennan Center posted with Holly Brewer and Rosemary Zagari, I copied down this quote because it says concisely what I was about to say to you in less beautiful words. This is from her. She says, I believe we are at a critical and pivotal moment in the nation's history, comparable only to the period right before the Civil War. What happens over the next few years will determine whether our democracy will survive in a recognizable form or the Constitution will become essentially a dead letter. That sounds extreme, and I absolutely agree with what she's saying. What we're talking about with presidential immunity, when we're batting it about here and talking about whether somehow or other presidents have criminal immunity of some kind, we're talking about some fundamentals of the Constitution and how it limits power. And if we buy into this idea that even though it's not stated in the Constitution that it meant to give this kind of above the law power to the president, the Constitution essentially becoming a dead letter is the direction that we're moving. I want to say, I'm not saying by agreeing with that statement that we're right on the cusp of a civil war, because that's a complicated statement, and I don't mean to be saying that here. But what I do mean to be saying is that in the Civil War era, there were fundamental constitutional issues being debated, fundamental, that couldn't ultimately be agreed upon, and there was a civil war. And after the Civil War, in many ways, there was a new constitution, new understanding of what it meant that grew out of that conflict. And I totally agree with what Rosemary Zagari is saying here. We're at another one of those moments when, in one way or another, we're going to have to decide what the Constitution means. And by doing that, not just debate constitutional law, but talk about what it means as a pact that we, the people, have signed onto, what it means as a statement of government. We are at that moment, and history can inform us, in this case, pretty powerfully, to smack at ideas that might seem politically useful at this moment, but really have no grounding in history. So I'm thrilled and proud that all of these historians step forward at this moment in time with this particular issue to essentially say, no, nope, there is no way that that makes sense, particularly if you're claiming it's grounded in the Constitution. That's beyond, I think I called it pablum somewhere on social media. There's no grounding in the Constitution or in history for that kind of interpretation of presidential immunity. Okay, I will stop. I went over. Oh, I won't stop. I will close my notes because there you go. I always say this every week. I put my notes up over chat so that I can't see what you guys are saying to each other, because otherwise I'd get involved. And that means I can't see people saying mug, mug, mug. Okay. This one's kind of obvious. And this mug, for those of you who are here for the first time, for a bazillion weeks, I've had a mug that reflects in some way or another what I talk about that week. And I do not have hundreds of mugs. I've been creative, and the History Matters community has been kind in going along with my creative deployment of mugs. This one was given to me by someone, and it's even possible someone may have guessed already what it is. It's my president mug.
Yeah, I love that one.
Who gave this one to me?
I remember there used to be a mug spreadsheet that somebody helped
I
us
know this one came from the NCHE convention that I was at. Whoever gave it to me, thank you. If maybe that'll come up during our chat, but
might have been Jenny from Illinois. I don't remember. I don't know
anyway,
if she's not
it
today.
is the perfect, you know, it's sort of hilarious that every morning, like I run into the kitchen, I'm like, oh, and now that I have my cold coffee, thanks to Annie suggesting I have my, you know, bottled coffee, which I do, but I run into the kitchen, I open the cabinets, and I'm like, mug, 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 mug. And today I was like, president, president, president. It's an easy choice. So anyway, let me open this so I can see what people are saying. I see that Teen Vogue is coming.
Oh, I put a link. I was telling them that I'm working on a piece about Columbine anniversary coming up.
Oh,
That was like really early in my career, and then just thinking about all the ones that have happened since then. And I mentioned that we had published one earlier with them. This will be the second one that we've collaborated. This one's going out through Instagram stories. So we're desperately trying to reach Millennial and Gen Z. So you got to meet them where they are, right? So they don't want to read the whole article, but they'll read what they call an explainer, which looks like an Instagram post, but then there's an arrow and it's really like 4 pages of Instagram posts. We're like tricking them into reading an article, but they think it's an Instagram post.
very cool.
Yeah. So I'm trying to explain how that all worked on there, but yeah. That mug, I feel like Jenny Banowitz from Illinois might have given you that one.
I am not good at remembering
She's with
this.
us today. I'll ask her.
This is totally beside the point, but someone is asking, is it possible to see Annie and Joanne at the same time? I think if you put your view on gallery.
I can see 4 boxes.
Me too.
You and I are like diagonal today. You never know what order they're going to be in. It's so weird.
I know it bounces around.
Yeah.
But at any rate, I can see both. But that's very cool, Annie. Like the whole idea and just the effort itself is very, very cool.
It's been a good partnership with Made by Us, which is a Smithsonian campaign to engage Millennial and Gen Z. Your students could get involved because they're still in that age bracket.
Yeah. Well, you know, part of what drives Heather and I to go on Instagram and do our little 10-minute chats is because it's going to be a different demographic, not as explicitly and strategically targeted as what you're doing, but still the same idea.
Yeah. I want to help me remember in the after part. I want to ask you a question about, I have an idea.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. And yes, Dave, Annie is very.
If we have questions, oh, we do. Oh my gosh, this chat box is full. All right. The first one up, Bonnie Chittister asks, what is the significance of the number 1755 in your Twitter handle? She's wondering if she thinks that she saw Heather in Memphis last week and neither of them knew. So people are curious about your Twitter handle. Maybe she said that for the after party, but
That's okay. It's a very short answer. Yes, and Carolee got it. It's one of the possible years that Hamilton was born.
ah.
And that's appropriate for now, given that Hamilton in presidential power is kind of on the talking block. But yeah, that's what it is.
Okay, I love how Linda Shalish opens her question. It says, "This is a really nerdy question about Charles Pinckney."
Okay.
There's a citation in the amicus brief, page 24, from 1800, where Pinckney said the framers did not intend any immunity. Is Pinckney reliable? Ooh, she's fact-checking Pinckney here.
Wow.
At least as far as that plan of his that disappeared in 1787, but he mysteriously found and gave to John Quincy in 1880 when asked for it. So she's asking about the 1880 plan not being the same as the 1787 plan. And then she mentions a bunch of scholars that have been debating back and forth. So she's wondering, will the justices give credence to Pinckney about immunity because his reputation was sullied by a fake? She thinks.
Well, I think, I mean, I'll give one obvious answer, which is if it was only relying on Pinckney, I suppose we might be able to have a conversation, except it's not only Pinckney that's making this point. What's interesting about the 19th century is that in a variety of different ways, again and again and again, people were either going to the framers and the founders and saying, explain what you did, explain it, or things were getting published of their letters and people were reading them and trying to figure out. I mean, this idea of going to the founders to see what they think and what they said and then pulling from that something to say about the government, that goes way back. So some of what we're talking about, you have to put it in the context of the time. So I wouldn't hold forth here on later versions of what Pinckney said without actually going to read the context in which they were published and what was the reason for what people were saying, why people were saying what they were saying. But the easiest answer here is he's not the only guy, like he's not the only source for what we're talking about here. So we don't even have to worry about that, how credible he is. And I just can't hold forth on that until I would look at the different versions and why they were different at different times.
Okay. Cece asks, and I love people have some really good opening sentences today in their questions. Cece says, Joanne, knowing that you are not a psychic, can you say what you think could be the result or fallout from a decision going either way, either no immunity or yes to immunity? Because she's just curious, like what your thoughts are on either, like what would be the fallout from either one.
I mean, I agree with Rosie Zagari. Yes, on immunity changes the fundamental nature of the presidency, of presidential power, of the underpinning of the Constitution. It fundamentally, number one, changes our government in ways that I can't even fathom the impact of that. But having it be a democratic republic, democracy is not going to survive that if that kind of immunity is granted. If it is assumed that the president is above the law. The end. And Heather always uses the phrase hair on fire, right? We're talking like our hair on fire. Some part of me always my hair is on fire these days, but in this case I don't think that's an extreme statement, and I believe what Rosie said. As far as what happens, if they say no, that there isn't immunity, well, I am not a psychic and I can't predict, because we live in times where people keep finding increasingly what do I want to call them, novel and strange ways to try and insist on things that don't have much grounding. So I have no idea where things go after that, but I can say that if the idea of immunity goes through, our Constitution will no longer be the same document that it was. The government pact that joins us together as a nation will no longer be working in the same way that it has been. And the presidency will take 3 giant steps towards pretty much being a monarchy, someone who's immune from crime. I don't know how to put it more dramatically than that, but pretty big stakes here. And as I sort of suggested at the outset, the fact that we have to debate this, the fact that we are here, and that in and of itself is so indicative of the extreme moment that we're in. So, you know, I was like, of course I'll sign on to this. And when I was first contacted, and then it was like, oh my God. Like,
Wow.
and that's why I recommend you read the brief, because it it it's so blunt and so straightforward and makes it so clear in such a good way. Okay.
I read it in the airport while I sat there for 500 hours. It was very,
Hey, well, that was
yeah.
good.
I actually had a conversation. I was like showing it to people. I'm like, my friend helped write this. You need to read this. This is important. You need to talk to your kids. From the airport, we're like, I hope that lady gets on her plane soon.
Well, and the fact that I can't, I'd have to go back and find the people who said, I'm going to use this in class next week or whatever.
Oh.
Not college professors, you know. I thought pretty cool. So
Carolee and I have this large group chat with about, I don't know how many people are on there, Carolee, like 30 people that like social studies nerds, K-12, and it's been chatted about on there too. So it's going to get used a lot. Okay, I'm combining two questions.
one quick thing. Someone asked about the date. So yeah, hearing April 25th is the date when this is first going to be heard. I think I read this morning that June is probably when there'll be some kind of decision. So it's not, you know, immediate is the opening of this as a real thing, but it won't be a while till we know the outcome. Okay, I'm sorry. Go right ahead.
So Deb and Lori both asked similar questions related back to Nixon and Ford. So I'm going to combine them. So Lori was saying, other than Watergate, has there ever been a president for whom criminal charges were seriously considered following their presidency? And Deb was following up with the pardon of Nixon by Ford seemed reasonable at the time to heal the wounds, but in hindsight, did that do more harm than good, in that now it could be used as a precedent for immunity?
Right. I mean, I think, and we saw this already happening concerning January 6th, when there was, you know, Trump was immediately talking about who he could pardon or who wanted a pardon or who'd ask for a pardon, right? That pardons, the logic of this will bring us together again, this will get us past this moment, only goes so far. What the pardon actually means and what precedent it sets are vitally important and matter. So I don't think there should be like insto pardon put in play in the way that some people seem to think it should be put in play. Pardons set precedents, and they can be important, vitally important precedents that send things in a direction that can be dangerous. So I think right now, actually, generally speaking, in this moment, there's a lot of the logic of don't do this or don't ask this or don't press this because it will make things worse, and we want to, you know, end the national nightmare, bring people together. And you know, I've argued in one way or another, if you're not stepping forward to stand up for, you know, voting rights, or if you're afraid to work at a polling place, you know, if you're holding back, you are essentially being held hostage.
Yep.
By the people with the threats of violence, by the people who are suggesting you're going to be sorry if you do what you have the perfect right to do. Holding people hostage because, you know, it'll be worse if you do that, so don't do it because we want things to get better. That's not a handy logic in the realm of political, what do I want to call it? The problematic precedents existing at the moment, the realm of politics, the depth of the issues being debated right now. Let's just say nothing because it'll be nicer that way, is not a useful, safe logic at this moment, as far as like backing away and saying nothing. Rights matter right now, and we need to think about that and decide how we're going to act on that. This isn't a moment to sit down and shut up.
This will be a quick one. Francesca wanted to know, are the founders and the framers the same? Knowing she's from across the pond.
No. Well, okay. So here's my interpretation of that. Years ago, there was like, as there would be on Twitter, like a great debate about this. I think generally speaking, The founders is broader and refers to, it's why I sometimes say founding generation, which is more, encompassing. And it means, not 10 guys in a room, but still the founders has to do with people active in the founding period. The framers usually is meant to specifically refer to those who framed the Constitution. So typically framers means Constitution, and you could be a founder and a framer, but those typically are used to mean two different things.
All right. Andrew is asking, do you think the Supreme Court will be calculating the risk of giving this level of immunity to Biden and other Democratic presidents? That is, a faction of the court will want to get Trump out of trouble, but will that also probably lead to protections for Biden?
Well, I mean, even apart from Biden, the logic here being we're going to do whatever we can do to protect Trump, and the seeming unwillingness to consider what the precedents mean once they're put in place. So not only in and of themselves is something like presidential immunity problematic, why assume you and the people you like are always going to be in power? Like, once you establish that precedent, it applies to anyone in some way or another, right? Any president. It's such an example of how the immediate politics of the moment are driving a lot of what, and by moment, I mean like literally moment by moment, are driving the Trump team. We got to do this. No, let's do this. No, let's do this. No, let's do this, because we got to find a way to avoid trials, to keep him safe, to whatever you want to fill in that blank. We're going to change our strategy minute by minute because this is what we're focused on, and not thinking in the way that, whatever you could say about the founders and the framers and the ways in which they didn't think in ways that they should have, they did think about posterity. They were self-interested and they were politicians, but they also were very aware that they were doing something not just for the immediate moment, but something that by its nature deliberately was going to shape the nation in the future for posterity. And right now, people aren't even thinking to next year, right? They're thinking of how can we put up this trial right now as far as the Trump team is concerned. That's not useful or healthy when you're talking about broad constitutional precedents.
Yeah. All right. Dave is using your favorite word here. He says, is this SCOTUS decision a moment of contingency for democracy in the US if SCOTUS agrees with Trump on the issue of presidential immunity? If so, can you elaborate on how this will play out?
Well, it is a moment of, we are in a moment of extreme contingency. I know I've said that 100 times, and if there are folks here who are new, sometimes people play bingo because I say certain things all the time, and contingency is a big one, even extreme contingency. We are in that kind of moment. I mean, and it does go back to, I said before, so if immunity is decided, that somehow there's a logic to that, that's a dangerous precedent. What will that mean? How will that play out? I have no idea. Right? I mean, it could do certain things. You can predict certain things that it might do as far as empowering Trump, as far as changing the nature of the presidency. I'm not even going to think about what happens to the current president, but I don't know how that plays out. But the fact is, we could probably sit here and in a conversation devise any number of possible outcomes, none of which would have been in our head like 20 years ago, right? The idea, again, that we're sitting here like, well, what if presidents have immunity and they can't be responsible for crimes? What? I mean, think back to like an earlier point, and not that much earlier in your life when that question, it would be surprising that it got quite so much play. Nixon has its own special place in our historical heart as far as considering this question. But still, we are at a moment of extreme contingency of the sort that I talk about all the time in early America. And again, as I suggested a moment ago, part of what I love about teaching early America, they were making it up as they went along. And that there's room for creativity, there's room for change, there's room for growth, there's room for disaster, right? All of those things are possible at moments of extreme contingency. And that's such an important thing to bear in mind now, is that our being in this kind of moment means that on the one hand, yes, things might get even worse, right? Things could get really bad because we can't predict whether they will or won't. And in a moment of extreme contingency, that's possible. It's also possible that we will be able to use this moment to improve something, to secure rights, constitutional rights, to bolster some of the barriers that have been knocked down, norms. Moments of extreme contingency are moments where you can work for better as well as be subject to worse. And I think it's easy to focus on the worse and the downside and forget that there can be positive growth and creativity in how we respond to this moment and how we, even though others won't, how we think not only about the present, but about posterity.
Yeah. Dave, our good buddy Dave, who shows up a lot, and we love him so much. He always asks great questions. Dave says, what SCOTUS cases in the past were wildly out of step with public sentiment? Where there's certain cases so out of step in other eras where people felt like the court had lost credibility. Are we now post-Dobbs, Citizens United, Bush v. Gore decisions? What happens when SCOTUS loses all credibility?
Well, I will say one distinctive thing about the current moment, and certainly it's not the first time that people have questioned the Supreme Court, but what's distinctive about this moment is that the Trump administration and the people surrounding it spent much of his presidency trying to undermine national institutions and their credibility, to secure more power for the president and to smack away at things that got in the way, right? So there are any number of kinds of national institutions, partly because of them, partly just generally. But, think about, I mean, not just like Congress, but like, what is it? The name is right out of my head. The folks who deal with COVID, and the name is right out of my head. The initials that go with it. And NIH. Thank you very much. CDC. All of that. That there are all of these organizations. Add to that now the national press. Add to that now faith in the voting process and how much faith we can have in that. In one way or another, there's been such an erosion as far as faith in national institutions of all kind. The Supreme Court and feelings about it, in part, are grounded as part of that moment. If you're trying to undermine authority around the presidency to prop up the power of the presidency, and if you're doing that by striking at national institutions, yeah, then the Supreme Court is going to suffer. But right now, also, it's not the first time that the Supreme Court has been so obviously politicized, right? It's not as though there was a glorious moment when the Supreme Court had no politics involving it at all. But right now, at this moment, and given questions about things like, oh, I don't know, ethics, there are many reasons why the Supreme Court is problematic. It's always been, in a sense, the weakest branch, right, as opposed to the other two branches of government. It makes rulings, but enforcement in one way or another comes from elsewhere. But so have there been other moments in history when the Supreme Court has done something that felt like it was against public sentiment, or that had huge amounts of public sentiment against it? It depends on what you say. You could point to things like Brown v. Board of Education or Dred Scott and say lots of people supported those major decisions. Lots of people didn't like those major decisions, and they had major, major outcomes. And, those are cases in which the major outcomes, among other things, they alerted people to rights being taken away and encouraged activism of a sort. So again, I guess what I will say, I see that we're running out of time. What I want to say here is that be aware and alert in this moment about what's happening now, and think for yourself and read all the stuff I just told you about during this episode. Think for yourself, read for yourself, and consider the long-standing implications. Don't get caught up in well, we're going to do this now because here's what it's going to do now. That's important. But you need to think about and act upon assumptions about what it means on a broader scale in a way that some people on the Trump team would rather we don't think about, right? Posterity, the broader impact. This makes sense. We can find it in the Constitution. Not really, but we're going to say we can, and then we're going to apply it. And then we can't have the trial, right? Right? That's thinking in a box. And we can't afford to think in a box at a moment where there's such sweeping change of a negative kind possible.
All right. Do we have time for one more?
Yeah.
Okay, this is a new name to me. If you've been with us for a while or before Harold Wilson, I don't recall, but thank you for joining us today and for your question. He says, how much of the rise of the idea of the imperial presidency or the decline and dysfunction of the role of Congress as a co-equal branch of government underpins the notion of presidential immunity? He asked, is there some restoration of the functional role of Article 1's branch of government, the way addressing or envisioning the role of the executive branch as defined by the founders?
Well, this raises an important point that I need to make too, which is, the Trump team went back to the founding and the Constitution to make their argument, but the fact of the matter is, obviously, the presidency has evolved in all kinds of ways over the course of our history as a nation. It's evolved as an office. It's been empowered in many ways that it wouldn't have been seen as possible when it started. And public assumptions about the presidency and the centrality of the presidency to our understanding of national government, all of those things have changed over time. So as I've been caught up in the sort of founder framer argument of this, but it is also worth noting that over time, ideas and understandings have evolved and precedents have been set, which is why we have to think about this current moment. And those need to figure into what we're doing now too, right? That things have changed. I mean, I've talked about this before, I think, but when I was working on my last book and focused really on Congress in pre-Civil War period, that's a moment in time when it was Congress that got the majority of inches of coverage in the press, right? Column inches. Congress was at the center of everything. Congress was where the people were really watching. The presidency hadn't yet quite assumed the kind of centrality when we think about national politics that it would a little bit later on. So that's just one example of many in which, as the American people, our understanding of the government and what's important and what isn't has changed. It's also a reminder of the fact that our understanding of government and what's important or isn't really matters, right? It matters what we accept as normal or don't. That matters a lot, right? And particularly during elections, but not only during elections. Speaking up, protesting, acting, in a way that makes it clear that you can see what's happening and that you have opinions about it and that you want other people to think about what's happening, change what's happening. Whatever you can do, whatever form of activism you can take, that has to grow from being in this moment and thinking about long-term implications.
All right. We are a little over, probably
We
a
are
good.
a little over. I see I'm trying to catch up here as to what people are saying. There's an early book, it's an old book, but it talks about the presidency in the early years when it was kind of being invented, and I think it's called Inventing the Presidency.
Then we'll find a link.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's in my New Haven house library and it's got a light blue cover, but I can't for the life of me. I want to say it's edited by Kellogg is his last name, but I'll wait for you guys to brilliantly find it because I think it's Inventing the Presidency. It's the name of it, but I could be conflating things. Inventing the Presidency. No, what? Definitely not a podcast. It's a book. I'll if I find it, I will post it somewhere on social media. Okay. So yeah, we are over. So let me explain to folks what's going to happen now. We are going to head into the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording what's going on here so that we can be even freer and easier in whatever we want to talk about, however we want to talk about it. If there is indeed, Cece, it is coming. If you are watching us from Facebook, you need to leave Facebook to join the after party and go to ncheteach.org/conversations. ncheteach.org/conversations. Yes, it could be Thomas Cronin, Melissa. And then once you do that, poof, you will be in the after party. If you are beamed in through the NCHE website, just stay right where you are. It's a double poof day, and poof, you will be in the after party too. I want to thank Claire Boo Boo the Blueberry and Annie and Jessica and John and everyone for making this possible and being part of our, the team that we are all part of to do this week after week after week after week. As ever, I want to thank the History Matters community for being here, for asking hard questions, for being and staying interested, for proving week after week that people care about this stuff. That all by itself is so important, right? I mean, the teachers in our mix, we know that for ourselves, but generally speaking, and I always brag about this. I'm always like, there's a community and they show up week after week, and many of them stay for 90 minutes because they're so engaged with the issues and with talking about it. And now we've become a community. Thank you for engaging in the conversation of democracy on a Friday morning. Thank you for asking the questions. Thank you for being here week after week. And we're going to have so many things to talk about. This is going to be such a freaking long couple of months. We'll see how it goes, but there certainly won't be a shortage of topics for us to really pull apart in weeks to come. So, okay.
Okay, we're waiting on Boo Boo.